All right, this is episode 2 of Reading with Ron, book 1 of Blood of the Prince, Greater Things Than Thou by R.L. Dean. Chapter 2. The old man sits his quill down, rubbing his fingers. Morning has come and gone, but he hasn't written much. It's not failing memory or even the pain of those memories that has slowed his progress. It's the pain and stiffness in his hands from numerous knife fights. He gets up and walks to the back porch. Under a towering pine, a sapling when he was first come to Gallon's refuge here in the forest, is the grave of Garrett. The old man dug that grave himself with his own scarred hands, but it should have been dug by Gallon. Princes use people up and leave the weight of their loss for others to bear. Decades have passed since that night, but I wonder how much better off I am now than I was then. I still have a faint scar on the back of my neck where Baylor struck me with the pommel of his sword. It took better than a week for the rashes to go away from the sack where it rubbed me. Sometimes I itch for no reason. Not long before his death, Siren told me that I should write about my story and have it printed at the fancy press in Whitefield so that everyone could read it. I feel I have to write this, and perhaps putting everything down in order will help me find some meaning in my life. I suppose I passed out. The transition from crying to the sense of free fall as I was dumped off the horse was a blank. I hit the ground, flat on my stomach. The breath knocked out of me. My mouth opened in a yell that came out more as a strangled whisper. "Careful with him," someone said. "Baylor wants him whole." There was a shuffle of boots and a loud snort. Then a new voice said, "I don't know why." They speculated on what Baylor would do with me and laughed, but the throbbing in my head made it impossible to concentrate on what they said. My body was coming alive with aches and my skin felt like it was blistering. I floated in and out of consciousness. Between the heat and pain, I was sure I would die tied up in the sack. When next I came to my senses, it was still hot, but now the suffocating heat of the sack. Instead, I was laying out on my back staring up at the dawn or evening sky, or the evening sky through pine tree branches. It was a scene out of a painting, those gray clouds lazily floating by. I felt disorientated and realized I had vomited on myself. I did it again. Afraid I would choke, I turned and rolled over, but the ropes now bound my hands in front of me and tied to my waist, and my feet were still held tight. I thrashed, turned my neck, and let the bile spill out on the ground. Eventually my jerking and choking garnered attention, and a pair of worn boots appeared by my head. A moment later, a heavy heel pulled back as if to stomp me, and I gritted my teeth and tried to tuck my head into my chest. The blow never came. I looked up at the filthy man standing over me. He was tall, with mismatched clothes that were torn in places. The tan face, with its thin, patchy beard, did not belong to the old man of the woods. "Keep quiet, boy," he snarled, then kicked dust and twigs in my face before walking away. Gil is long dead now, but I've never forgotten him. I found out very soon after that first night that he was in charge of me. Baylor ordered him to feed and keep watch over me, with instructions that he wasn't to harm me, or harm me to the extent that it wouldn't heal. Gil didn't like being a babysitter, and he detested me. I don't know how long I lay there, feeling sorry for myself and horrified at what was going to happen to me. Ever so slowly, like watching paint dry, dawn began to open the forest. Leaves and dirt had worked into my cuts and rashes. A stick poked in my back. As the light grew, every pain in my body seemed to intensify. It was not a trick of the light, but a trick of time. My body had been abused for so long without rest. Through the pain and aches, I took in my surroundings. I can say with certainty we passed through the black pine forest, or a thicket near it, because the trees were of that type, strong and tall black pines. Probably the southern edge of the forest, as Baylor would have stayed away from the northern districts because of the soldiers on regular patrols around the larger cities. He didn't have enough strength at that time to risk drawing state attention. Gallon thinks I was about 8 or 10 when Baylor took me. and he himself already enmeshed in the legitimate duties of a crown prince, rather than simply sitting beside his father the king like a handsome, smiling puppet. There are not many soldiers or oldsters like me still living who remember Baylor, but he was accomplished for his time. If he were more charismatic and attracted more reliable men, then he might have made himself a rebel and not a bandit. It was a makeshift camp, bedrolls, cooking pots over the remains of small fires, and slumbering men. They lay scattered as the dawn turned to morning, and they began to rise, coughing and hacking and spitting and peeing, weary men awakened from a night of half sleep. I didn't see Baylor at first, but I remember him bellowing from the other side of the camp. The few men still trying to sleep rose quickly. I heard rather than saw as he made his way across the camp to me. He looked even more disheveled than he had when he grabbed me that night. His eyes were bloodshot, and his beard had bits of bread and grit in them. Gil was with him, grimacing. For a few moments, Baylor just stared at me. Then he said, "Feed him, clean him up. Those cuts will become infected." Gil snorted, but Baylor ignored him and walked away. He watched Baylor's back. His face reminded me of a rat. It was easy to imagine those eyes turning red. He hunched down and grabbed my wrist with one hand and pulled a gutting knife from his belt. Cutting me loose wasn't a gentle process. With my feet still tingling from the blood rushing back into them, he half dragged me to the deer pond and dropped me in it. "I'm not a nursemaid," he yelled. "Get cleaned up." I was on my hands and knees in the water. I made the mistake of turning my head and staring at him. He kicked me over and started yelling again. "My name is Gil. You call me sir. Do what I say and when I say it." My heart was hammering in my chest, and I held my bladder for so long, and I was afraid that I peed on myself. With half-numb hands, I splashed water on myself and used my shirt like a washcloth. I cleaned my bloodied, matted hair, the scrapes and cuts in behind my ears. When Gil dragged me out of the water and back to the camp, he somehow found a pair of boots and made me wear them, explaining, "I don't want Baylor blubbering about your tender little feet." The boots were too big, but I felt strangely grateful. I was barefoot with only a shirt and pants when Baylor took me. When he saw that I was grateful, or when I say that I was grateful, I mean to Baylor himself, because it was fear of him that kept Gil from killing me. It was by Baylor's word that I was being cared for. Gil shoved a raw potato in my hand. My stomach was empty and I wanted it, but I stared at it. My hands were shifting between thinking that it could be my last meal and wondering what Baylor wanted from me. Why was he keeping me alive? But then I realized that he was not the old man of the woods. If he were then, surely I would have been dead already. So who was he? I couldn't have known it then, but Baylor had plans for me, and later Gallon, too, would have his plans for me. One of a self-proclaiming bandit king, the other a deposed prince. It's been decades, and I still wonder which of them left the deepest scars. Okay, we'll stop there today and pick up in chapter 3.